This week, we are still in Resurrection Sunday mode. So let's consider a big biblical idea. This one is so important that all stories, one way or another, reflect this idea. The big idea that the law of God should lead us to the grace of God. But how many stories get these concepts out of balance? When do these stories swerve too far toward law, and thus into legalism, or too far toward grace, and into cheap grace?
Speculative fiction, like no other genre, reflects the creativity of God.
If you look at the scriptures, you're going to have to see that God uses imagination more than rational discourse.
We are supposed to be image bearers for a vastly creative God.
Reading fantastical fiction opened a portal in my imagination for a place other than just a materialistic world.
I experienced the gospel story with the mind of someone who loved adventure and loved the idea of light conquering darkness.
We're wired for stories that reflect how we see the world in ways that are true.
The story is either pointing to Christ or it's pointing to our need for Christ.
Behold again, Fantastical Truth, the podcast from Lorehaven.com, where we explore fantastical stories for God's glory. I am E. Stephen Burnett, broken by the law alone, saved by grace alone. I'm the publisher of Lorehaven and the author of a new sci-fi novel launched last month from Enclave Publishing called Above the Circle of Earth.
And I'm Zackary Russell, the Merciful, and this is episode 260. How do great stories reflect both law and grace?
We're going to emphasize the great stories more at the end of this show. We got some negativity to get through first because as I look out upon the fruited plain of fiction, including the Christian-made stuff and including a lot of general market stuff, I see precious few stories, Zach, that seem to get both law and grace into the story in correct biblical proportion. But then again, lots of Christians struggle with these things, so it's not all that surprising that many of our non-Christian neighbors would struggle even more.
Yeah, or there's just a lot of stories that are abandoning both of these ideas. To quote one Star Wars show, which I don't want to talk about too much, this isn't about right or wrong anymore. This is about power. That's a direction a lot of stories are going in, just kind of bypassing all of this.
Well, power leads to law, law leads to power, and so a lot of people get nervous about that. They will decide, there's just too much law going on. It's all about power, and I know a lot of people who abuse their power, so maybe I ought to just go over here into Graceland, not the Elvis mansion, but where we only talk about grace, God's grace that is greater than all our what? Sin. It seems that the Bible still has a lot to say about sin and judgment and guilt and condemnation. So that is the gospel. We're going to talk all about the gospel in this episode, which is totally appropriate, given that just a couple of Sundays ago was Resurrection Sunday. However, we got a sponsor or two to talk about on the way. And first up is the 1232 audio drama presented by Oasis Family Media. It's an exciting, binge-worthy audio epic from creators Callie Sue and Cheyenne Landry of Rumble Stump Entertainment. This is a faith in action audio adventure for all ages. When the experimental research of a physicist goes awry, his estranged twin children follow him through time to medieval Wales in the year 1232 AD, where they come face to face with a brutal world filled with superstition and legends. Along the way, they meet a penniless leader, a dark sorceress, and a warrior priest, who provoke the twins into confronting the truth about themselves, each other, and Jesus Christ. There he is again, Zach. I think this episode, sponsors and all, is going to be very Jesus influenced. Specifically, season 1 of 1232 is a finalist in the Realm Makers Audio Drama Awards and is available now wherever you get your podcasts or audiobooks. Start listening today to 1232. That's 1232. And visit audio-epic.com. That's audio-epic.com to listen and learn more. See the show notes at lorehaven.com for more about 1232 and all the sponsors in this episode. Hey, speaking of Realm Makers, the bookstore, the expo, Zach, I got some more updates about that before we move forward. The first one is that the Realm Makers bookstore is coming to Teach Them Diligently, the homeschool convention in Pigeon Forge in Eastern Tennessee. That is from May 8th through 10th of this year, just a couple of weeks from now, 2025, May 8th through 10th, Thursday through Saturday. And Zach, I skipped last year because I was working on Above the Circle of Earth, even though I couldn't say so at the time. But now that novel is out, and so am I. I get to go back on the road with the Realm Makers Bookstore, who very kindly invited me to join them there with a bunch of other great folks there in Pigeon Forge, including but not limited to sci-fi author Clint Hall. And I saw that Mike Naraki of the Dead Sea Squirrels fame and previously VeggieTales fame is also coming back to the Realm Makers Bookstore. That's at the Teach Them Diligently convention, May, 8th through 10th. Yes, in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. I'll have more details about that before and after. Of course, we're also preparing, Zach and I, for the big Realm Makers Expo. That is July 18th through 20th, the inaugural expo, expanding from the Writers' Conference for Realm Makers. That's going to be at the DeVos Convention Center at Grand Rapids. Registration is now open at realmmakers.com. I will be there also. Lorehaven will be there. Zach will be there. I'll be signing copies of Above the Circle of Earth and have a bunch of other surprises planned. But I'm seeing some surprises, Zach, from Realm Makers. They just announced that the director of Mulan in 1998, Tony Bancroft, who's also got his own animation studio, doing the next animated Jesus movie, because now we're getting apparently half a dozen per year of those, called Light of the World. Tony Bancroft is going to be there. Mike Naraki is also coming there. A bunch of folks are going there, along with Lorehaven. But we got a whole booth this time. Not a table, but a booth. Time to upgrade. Time to get this movement really going for Christian-made fantastical stories, along with the Writers' Conference.
Oh, that's really cool. Yeah, this will be really fun to meet Tony Bancroft. I've also met Barry Cook before, who was involved with Mulan, and Davey Leo, who has a thing, You Can Do It, or Can Do Kids, which is, I met him at another, what was that? Another homeschool Christian conference. So it was, I think, one of the animators for Mulan. It's pretty cool. Like, there's a number of really awesome believers that have been involved, and that gives me hope that there are other Christian artists that are still involved at Disney and Star Wars and Marvel. And there's always people behind the scenes that we don't know much about till much later. But yes, I'm looking forward to meeting these folks and some others I've learned that are coming to Realm Makers as just a fan. Like, they're not going to be teaching the writers classes I'm going to. They're going to be there hosting things, and there's going to be a screening that's I'm excited about at the expo. What is that? Is it the King of Kings one, or is it?
No, it's Light of the World. King of Kings is out in theaters now. Yeah, right. I know it's easy to get them confused. Even you guys are working on it.
It's amazing. Yeah, we're getting so many different biblical stories, which was our previous episode you can go listen to. So yeah, I'm looking forward to being there as a creator and a fan.
Well, I'm especially looking forward to signing those copies. I now get to be an author at the Realm Makers Expo. And yeah, it's still a writers conference, but as Zach mentioned, it is even more fan-friendly now. Registration now open July 18th through 20th for the Realm Makers Expo at the DeVos Place Convention Center in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Go to realmmakers.com for more information about that, and we'll have more updates going forward from now through summer. Well, let's get back to the Bible now. I have a key scripture text here. It's very important to understand this idea from the scripture of law and grace, because everybody listening now comes to this from a certain vantage, and almost certainly that's informed by how you grew up. Did you grow up in an evangelical environment? Did you grow up outside of it? What did you get too much of, and what did you then come to realize you wanted more of? Some people grew up with what they felt, or what was, too much law, which means the law being abused outside of its biblical context. And then others grew up with too much of what they felt was grace. In other words, grace being abused in its biblical context. Law was cheap, or grace was cheap. I hear a lot about people saying cheap grace, but I'm actually going to refer here to cheap law, which is legalism, which actually isn't too much law. It is too little, because you are not applying the law as it needs to be applied. And this is how the Apostle Paul, no greater authority there other than Christ himself in the Bible, applies the law in his epistle to the Romans, chapter 3, verses 21 through 31. Reading now in the ESV. But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. For there is no distinction, For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by his grace as a gift, through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood, to be received by faith. This was to show God's righteousness, because in his divine forbearance he had passed over former sins. It was to show his righteousness at the present time, so that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. I'm going to pause the quote there and just go over that last phrase very quickly. Why did God pass over former sins? He had divine forbearance. God was patient. But God could not simply ignore those sins without some sort of penalty for it. The propitiation by Christ's blood. Something had to die. There had to be a price paid for this incredible debt of sin. And if God had just kicked the can down the road on into eternity, would have called into question his holiness. He had to show his righteousness. Very, very important concept there for this episode. Moving on to finish Paul's quote from Romans. Then what becomes of our boasting? It is excluded. By what kind of law? By a law of works? No, but by the law of faith. For we hold that one is justified by faith apart from works of the law. Or is God the God of Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles also? Yes, of Gentiles also, since God is one, who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith. Do we then overthrow the law by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law. That was Romans chapter 3, 21 through 31. And again there, Zach, at the end, Paul is explicitly disclaiming the idea that grace gets rid of the law, that grace replaces the law. Paul is saying, no, God is not just the God of Jews who were famously given the law. He's not just the God of Gentiles who now come in under that covenant of grace. It's the same God. It's the same plan. It's the same gospel. It's the same salvation for everybody. And if you're getting confused about that, you've got to go back and read Romans and all the other letters that Paul wrote in the New Testament.
I was really influenced early on in my Christian life by Ray Comfort, who has a really good series on evangelism, but there's kind of a fundamental point he starts with, which is Psalm 19:7. The law of the Lord is perfect, refreshing the soul. There is a good purpose to the law, and I think, as Christians, it's easy to fall into this trap of like, well, we don't need the law anymore because we don't follow the Old Testament and we're Gentiles anyway. And it's like, well, we always have to go back to why did God give the law? And there's this other verse that Ray Comfort goes to, which is, and this is the King James version of Galatians 3:24. The law was our schoolmaster to bring us to Christ, that we might be justified by faith. So that's the end result. And that just summarizes entirely, like pretty much most of the Bible. The law, there was a good purpose to it, which is to revive our soul, but to ultimately what? Not justify us, but to bring us to the one who would justify us by faith through his grace. And so you have to look at the law in terms of the whole picture of God's plan. It's not something that's just passed away. And Jesus even said, I've not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Now, obviously, a lot of discussion is about what do we do now? And, what are we getting too much into legalism or cheap grace, which I know we're going to get into here.
We absolutely will. And one little speculative scenario, speaking of biblical fiction, that I like to imagine that illustrates for me the importance of God's law and this idea that God has put into real history over and over throughout generations and hundreds of years. This idea of if you sin, something has to die. If you sin, something has to die. Blood must be shed. That is the penalty, is death. Going back to the Garden of Eden, the first thing God did after Adam and Eve sinned was he provided skins for them, an animal skin, which means there had to be the death of an animal. So almost immediately, God himself is performing a kind of sacrifice to cover them, to cover their shame. This idea is so fundamental to the Old Testament, so fundamental to the real world. But I think it probably, Zach, bothers a lot of people because they are conditioned to think of shame and guilt as something always bad. But it is there in Genesis 3.
Just this week, Stephen, Naomi and I had a really good long conversation with a friend of ours we've gotten to know over the last couple of years. And he just had this great question. He said, can forgiveness not happen without blood sacrifice? Why would God, who's all powerful, have to require something so painful to forgive people he's created? And I'm like, that's a great question, man. And so, yeah, we walked through Genesis, like you said. And I said, well, look, first of all, God always planned to provide the sacrifice for us. That's why I was like, you may be familiar with images of Adam and Eve with like the fig leaves, but that's what they used to try to cover themselves, and it didn't work. But what actually they were clothed with was animal skins that God provided for them. But to his kind of deeper question of like, well, why would God require death in the first place? I said, well, you have to understand what sin is. Sin is cutting yourself off from the author of life, and it's rebellion. And once you rebel, you're cut off. Then you don't have life anymore. And God told them this. He warned them that on the day you sin, you will die. Now, they started to die physically, but they were immediately dead spiritually. And I said, part of the problem today is that we often think of sin in two categories. There's the no big deal type sin, like a little white lie, or there's the unforgivable sins, like however our culture or our law defines that. And all sin is, first of all, vertical, but it's foolishness and chaos, but it's ultimately rebellion. It's sort of a spiritual suicide that we move into a place of death. That is the punishment for sin. And that's not pleasant to think about, but it's only logical since God is who gives us life, and we can't have life apart from him.
So, one little biblical fiction that helps me illustrate this is some speculation about the Garden of Eden. And it certainly would help Adam and Eve to recognize the seriousness of their sin when they were knowing God personally. The scripture says that he walked with them in the garden. God in some way was present there. Don't know if they could see him. Don't know if it was just a ball of cloud or light or whatever. It's very mythical, but very historical. So it's difficult to imagine. But you can imagine then how Adam and Eve felt when they realized they'd betrayed this entity who created them by following the words of an entity who did not, who was an imposter. But now imagine a weird alternate scenario where Eve gives birth, as she seems to have expected. At least some commentaries say she seems to expect to give birth to some sort of savior figure. Imagine if she had. Imagine if somehow Jesus arrives when Adam and Eve are still alive. And then he does the whole, die and, atone for them through his shed blood narrative. Now, that would not work, because even Adam and Eve, being hyper intelligent and walking with God in the garden in the cool of the day, would not have, I think, understood the seriousness of sin. There would not have been thousands of years and generations of history where Jewish people were performing the sacrificial duties. If you sin, something has to die. If you sin, something has to die. Blood must be shed. Is it because God is vengeful? No, because he is righteous. As the Apostle Paul says, he has to show that he is righteous. Otherwise, you don't take it seriously. Otherwise, you do not take him seriously. You do not know him. You do not know how holy he is, how perfect, and how, by comparison, gross and repugnant our sin is.
Yeah, we don't actually want to live in a world where sin is not punished, because most of our complaints are about injustice or delayed justice or inverse justice, where the innocent are punished and the guilty are let free. We all have a sense of wanting justice. And the problem is the price is much higher than we are comfortable paying.
Without specific knowledge and appreciation and even love, like the psalmists, for God's law and the reason for which he gave it, we're not going to move beyond law into love and grace and mercy. We're going to move into some sort of imposter God syndrome where we pretend that we are the judges, making up the laws, not enforcing them. We're going to end up insisting that we can forgive the people we like and show mercy to them, but to our enemies, to the people we don't like, even if we're in the wrong, we will impose the law. The cheap grace folks, Zach, I've noticed they always end up being very legalistic in certain directions and very gracious in very limited directions. And I think, Zach, it's because they're reading the wrong kinds of stories. So, not just the biblical narrative, but also fictional stories about law and grace. We'll go into chapter 1 now. Great stories illustrate God's law. Not, I mean, they positively illustrate the law. God's law is his righteous standard for perfect love and obedience. His law is good. It is justified because it is defined by God himself. And last week, as you mentioned, Zach, we talked about biblical fiction that is meant to illustrate biblical truth and history and personalities, not instruct people about these like a sermon or a nonfiction book. And I say here that other types of fiction, not just biblical fiction, will do this with the idea that there exists a moral law, that to some extent it is written on human hearts. People generally recognize certain rights and wrongs, and that one way or another, this moral law is baked into the universe as it is. If it's a Christian-made story, you understand that God is somehow at the back of it, or he's explicit, like an Aslan or someone like that. But it's a non-Christian story. There's just unquestioned moral absolutes in the universe that no one ought to be violating. Or if someone is violating it, then he becomes some kind of a gray area character, an anti-hero, or more likely a villain. We're trained on this. If you grew up in evangelical Sunday school, for example, especially if it was a sort of more moralistic or virtue-based Sunday school class, you may have had Sunday school lessons that at least you remember as being mainly about this idea that it's good to be good, so that's why you should. And in the end, the child characters in the Sunday school lesson will learn, not to break the window with their baseball bat, or not to tell a fib, or how it's never good to cheat on an exam. The point of the story doesn't necessarily revolve around the plot or the characters. It's about the moral virtue. And even now we see, it's kind of unfortunate sometimes parents want to know, well, what's this book about? Is this book going to be free of agenda? In other words, is it just going to be neutral? Is it going to teach basic right from wrong? Well, I don't necessarily criticize that here, although that can go in some bad directions. But I myself appreciate stories that are meant for older viewers or readers that uphold this general idea that there is a right, there is a wrong, they are different, and that the good guys follow the right. Fairy tales and their modern versions will generally show heroes as attractive characters and villains as ugly characters. And of course, that got a little bit fuzzier with the Disney remakes and all of that, but we won't go into that. But that at least has been the idea before you bring in the moral nuance and such. These stories will also show the goodness in man-made authority structures. And Zach, recently I've been rewatching some Star Trek Next Generation, as is my wont. I'm in the 7th season, which isn't the best season, but it has some really good standout stories. And some of the best Star Trek television episodes, not necessarily the movies. The television episodes will celebrate the Federation as this benevolent humanist military exploration organization, multiplanetary alliance, as a good thing. And the military command structure on the starship as a good thing to be respected. There's a moment when both Captain Picard and First Officer Riker are away from the ship. So Data, who is an android, highly trained, but nonetheless an android, so he has no emotions. He is next in line for command of the ship. So he is commanding the ship, and Lieutenant Commander Worf has to be first officer. And Worf starts questioning publicly Data's decisions, even though Data is hyper competent and making overall good decisions. He's just not very good at explaining them or minding his crew's emotions. So Data says, okay, we're going to do this. And then Worf under his breath says, finally. And Data just invites Worf very firmly to the captain's quarters and says, Mr. Worf, you're questioning my command in front of others. The first officer must obey the captain, even if he privately disagrees with the orders. Otherwise, the ship's authority command structure would break down. And Worf says, sir, I've always questioned the captain's orders. And Data says, yes, Mr. Worf, that's because at the time you were a tactical officer, that was your job. But as first officer, your job is to support the captain. If you cannot perform these duties, I'll have you reassigned. And then Worf agrees, and then it's a lovely moment, tinged with grace here. The acting captain, Data, says, Mr. Worf, on a more personal note, I hope this has not interfered with our friendship. And Worf says, no, sir, it is I who should apologize to you. So you got this wonderful moment there of camaraderie and respect, and fans still love moments like that because what's not being questioned there? That the captain is the absolute authority on the ship, and only in the most drastic of circumstances would you ever dream of mutinying against the captain. And that kind of moral order is also in detective stories or police procedurals. that do assume, even if they're pushing the moral limits here and there, that the law is a good thing, that people have the right to vote upon laws and have laws passed by legislators, signed by governors, enforced by police, enforced by judges, and then you get the whole superstructure at the federal level as well. And then westerns, even westerns or space westerns, like we talked about a few episodes ago, they tend to have like good lawmen and bad outlaws. Yes, there are gray areas, and we talked about that some with Michael F. Caine about the spaghetti westerns that got more complex. But you can't get more complex. You can't go to that 201, 301 level class before understanding the 101 level truth, that there is a law, there is absolute right and wrong, and it is good for people to expect others to keep this law.
So a Star Trek episode I've been thinking about as we're talking here is from season 1 of Next Generation, episode 8, called Justice. This is one of my favorite episodes. It's one of the best ones from season 1, which if you're a fan of Next Generation, you know season 1 is has a lot of rough edges to it. And of course, Riker doesn't have the beard and all that.
Yeah, it's all Roddenberry's fault.
Yeah.
Actually, sorry.
But to summarize this episode, if you are a listener not familiar with it, the crew arrives on this planet where everyone is young and beautiful and probably not wearing enough clothing. And
yeah, that's an awkward episode.
Yeah. And so Wesley, like any teenager's like, hey, I want to go play with the other beautiful teenagers and, maybe get to know one of them a little bit. So they go off and play a game of, sports ball of some kind. And Wesley, trying to catch a ball, crosses a barrier that they warned him not to cross. And then he crashes through like a greenhouse or something and breaks a window. And so then these security guards arrive and assess the situation. Wesley admits what he did, and they're like, all right, time to die. And they basically are just going to execute him on the spot. And so then they are able to stop it. But the crew learns that on this planet, every crime is punishable by death. Every single infraction, anything you do wrong, death penalty. And that's why everyone's so young. So this was, and then to make it even crazier, there is this interdimensional entity that orbits the planet as some kind of god of this entire star cluster. And so then they get into this sort of supernatural battle of the wits against this entity and trying to get Wesley free while still not violating their laws or the Prime Directive. And honestly, the way it ends is it's a little bit of a letdown because Picard basically just gives a big speech and then they let Wesley go. But it's a really incredible episode in terms of like, this is how the law actually is. This is how the law works. Like the wages of sin is death. Like it's a good illustration of that. Picard, of course, makes the argument that, well, look, I'm not going to give up one crew member to save all 1,000, and I'm also not going to just let all 1,000 be killed. I'm just going to do what's right. And so he's like, look, I'm going to stick up for Wesley because he didn't know what the laws were. And his argument is, look, there should be exceptions to the law, and we could talk about that a little bit. But man, what a powerful episode about divine justice.
Well, that's the limits of a story like that, where you try to show this very localized space entity who's somehow, or which is somehow enforcing a law like this. Such a law doesn't really make sense if you ask too many questions or even just a few, because an entity like this, as I mentioned, is localized. It's like a single alien. Like, what moral right does this alien, this creature, have to impose law on anyone? Even if it's its own planet. Did this entity create the universe? No, it does not have the moral right.
And it also doesn't seem to have the same laws about promiscuity and stuff like that. So, those always get a pass for some reason.
Well, that particular law got a lot of passes in the first couple of seasons of Next Generation. But moving on, I'm seeing a lot more, Zach, I think, healthy regard, at least it starts healthy, for these kinds of stories that illustrate some sort of absolute moral principles, generally Judeo-Christian in their flavor. I think there was a recent Thomas Umstadt episode where he was talking about the popularity of lit RPG and how much this illustrates, especially among young men, this desire to conform to a structure, to find their place in a moral or moral-ish structure where there are absolute consequences and you level up and everything's very math-based and you get points and you upgrade your equipment and all of this. while still following the general parameters of a hero adventure story. So I appreciate that so much. It's certainly better than the sort of moral anarchy and navel gazing and rampant individualism that we've seen. But as you may have already guessed, faithful listener, there's a lot of hazards to this, which I do want to mention quickly before we move on to the grace chapter. Bad stories can subvert God's law into cheap law. And that's what I would also call legalism. Here's what John Piper said about legalism. I can't do the voice just now. It's too early in the morning, but legalism is the conviction that law keeping is now, after the fall, the ground of our acceptance with God. I will say that again. Legalism is the conviction that law keeping is the ground of our acceptance with God, the ground of God being for us and not against us. So if you ask, how can I get God to be for me and not against me? The legalist answer is keep the law, perform the law. That's John Piper. We'll have that link in the show notes. Now, you may not even believe in God and be a legalist, though. I've noticed this. It's the strangest thing, but all that means is that you are trying now to be legalistic and keep the law of your actual God. A last-minute substitute, even if it's you yourself or a false religion or a political leader or who knows what. That, I think, is an issue if those Sunday school lessons that illustrate general law principles and morality, if they are ignoring the plot to teach of reality, to teach abstract morals, and that's all you get, and then you grow up assuming that that's all Christianity is about, is the morals, law keeping, and then someday you'll go to heaven. That's an issue. And the same thing happens with certain evangelical social drama movies, even if they have conversion scenes in them, even if they do teach the gospel, instructing, by the way, more than illustrating. They will sometimes imply that you just pray this prayer and then your marriage will get fixed, or you'll get that big promotion, or your team will win the game. I don't think that's what the makers of these movies meant to imply. But if these movies get popular enough and this message gets out there, then God bless it, you have accidentally reinforced this cheap law. Do what's right, believe in Jesus, and then you'll get a happy life. Not necessarily true. Not necessarily true. You will get a happy life in eternity, and most importantly, you'll be reconciled to your author, Jesus Christ. But that doesn't necessarily guarantee a wonderful, happy life now. And some of these stories also ignore real moral complexities in the churches, among Christians, and in cultures. If you take out moral pieces of the Bible and then plug them into your system to improve all of these things, you end up with cheap law. Cheap law, not too much law. This is a misuse of God's law. The Apostle Paul would hate this. Jesus would hate this. He does hate this because you confuse the means for the ends. You forget that verse somewhere in the New Testament, which says if you break one little part of the law, then it's just like you're on that planet. Well, you've broken all of it and you're going to go to hell, and it is just that you go to hell. But if you misunderstand that the law was meant to break us, as I mentioned at the top of the show, to make us realize we can't keep the law, we need capital S, someone who did. That's what the law is for. And we cannot distort it like that. But Zach, I do see people distorting that in political movements and in certain social movements. Even some atheists are like, hey, we got to have some of God's law around here. Some conservative-leaning I can't say this. Even some conservative-leaning philosophers are enabling this view. People are correcting for lawlessness, and they want more stories about law. But unfortunately, we're going to see more of this, and it can lead people to be broken by the law, to embrace grace as they should, or it could lead people into becoming twice the sons of hell as before. We'll just have a new generation of Pharisees. Not great.
Yeah, we've talked before in this podcast. We did a whole episode about cultural Christianity, and there are some positives to that, in that it sometimes makes it a little bit easier to share the gospel with someone, which is actually what saves them, not just being culturally Christian. But there's a dark side to it as well, which is this legalism you've talked about, which is, the way I kind of define it is simply man-made laws that go beyond what God has said and lock people into a box that God did not intend them to be in. And this is why in Matthew 11:28, Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and take my yoke upon you, for it's easy and light, and you'll find rest for your souls. So often what we do to ourselves is so exhausting, way more than what the law of God is or intended to be. And, a classic story I think about in this regard is Les Miserables. you've got Inspector Javert, whose entire life is consumed by getting Jean Valjean into justice, to punishing him. And then when he's let go when he's in the mercy of Valjean at the end, and he's basically let go, he can't tolerate it. He's I followed the law. I followed the entire law my whole life, and he ends his own life because he can't fathom like doing anything wrong, and or according to his own code that's kind of extreme. I'm not as familiar with this fandom, but I know in Watchmen that Rorschach has a very black and white view of the world, like a very rigid view. And there's a lot of conflict with the other characters for that reason. And then, like, I don't recommend the show, but Dexter, he's like a serial killer who kills serial killers. So he has this very like rigid code of like how he selects his targets and what he'll do and not do. But the guy's a serial killer, so it's not okay. So he has a law, but is that actually a good law? So you can. But it's the same with like Breaking Bad. Walter White has this whole motivation of like, well, I'm going to provide for my family no matter what, and then the character that he ends up really looking up to, but then subverting ultimately, says to him, well, a man provides, and like that's just his whole moral code. It's like, okay, well, the ends justify the means, because that's the only code that matters. And so sometimes like our laws can be too weak. It can be like so narrow that in like so rigid that it's like you're not really fulfilling the law. You're fulfilling a law, maybe, but you can't do that by breaking all these other laws.
Zach, sometimes I feel like a weird fan in that I like stories in which authorities are presented as good and heroic and self-sacrificial, but I also like stories that present the disordered nature of those who would enforce the law. Lacey and I finally finished Andor Season 1, just in time for Season 2, assuming that it stays the course. And there's at least two figures in Season 1 of Andor who are trying their best to enforce the law, but clearly they misunderstand the point of the law, and they are in an abusive system, the Empire. There's Cyril Karn, who's like sort of this private security officer who's basically, I turned to Lacey finally and I said, oh, I know this guy. This is Inspector Javert. This is the Inspector Javert of the piece, or at least he's a rather low-level Javert who really wants to get up there in the system, who seems extremely very dedicated, but also he has this weird obsession with a member of the, what's the office now who's trying to investigate the rebellion, Deidre Miro. She's an Empire officer who's doing some really, really terrible things. Basically a proto stormtrooper or proto Imperial officer. Maybe she is an Imperial officer. But you see these people now, it's not just that, oh no, they don't have love in their hearts and they can't show mercy. Like, no, they're literally working for, space Satan, Emperor Palpatine. So you're already on the wrong side there. But also any story in which someone is trying to enforce the law without understanding the purpose of the law, not just love, not just good feelings or mercy all the time without question. But there's no place at all in this story for the fulfillment of the law, a hero like Jesus Christ. And we'll get to that in the next chapter.
Yeah. And something I've been thinking about lately is that so many of the movies and TV shows we've seen, and that are the majority of our shows in the last few decades, the cop is not the protagonist or the hero of the story. It's if anything, there's an outlaw or an anti-hero that's sort of the that saves the day. But there are a few exceptions to this, like 24, starring Kiefer Sutherland, the series. But really, he's only a CTU agent in like a few of those seasons. Most of the time, he's some kind of outlaw. And oftentimes, CTU itself is like the antagonist to actually stopping the terrorists or whatever, or the president is the big bad. And so there is definitely a lot of subversion of authority figures in that show, while trying to do the greater good or something. And it's so many of our movies are like, it's like a bank heist, but it's starring the bank robbers. And so we don't see a lot of movies where the law enforcement are the good guys.
Well, here's why it works for Andor and why all the shades of gray don't overwhelm the the good versus evil divide is that somewhere out there in this world there is absolute good, there is absolute evil. Despite whatever Obi-Wan said in Revenge of the Sith, Star Wars ultimately does enforce this idea of absolute good, absolute evil, a light side and a dark side, and the dark side is bad. Hint, hint. But what the rebellion is doing, whether or not they say so, is trying to get back to that republic, right? That good or better government, flawed though it is, that was lost, and the good ideal of the Jedi Knights, these disciplined enforcers of the law. So there's this idea of a better law out there, a better authority. It's not just, ultimately at least, it's not just a rebellion for rebellion's own sake. It's bad to do rebellion for rebellion's own sake. That is morally disordered. It is against God's law. And as you know, if you read your Bible right, if you keep the law, try to keep the law, you're supposed to feel terrible because you can't. You're not supposed to feel awesome because you can. The law is supposed to break you, as I mentioned earlier. You should be running. You should be running, going, wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? And that leads us to chapter 2. But first, you got to understand that failure to keep the law will put you in the ground, which makes me think of sponsor 2, Here Lieth by Johanna Frank. Discover a tale of redemption, courage, and destiny. Step into the pages of Johanna Frank's Here Lieth, an extraordinary blend of Christian fantasy and historical adventure. When a young soul faces the journey of life, the forces of darkness and light clash for the ultimate prize, his destiny. With rich, vivid storytelling and a message of hope, Here Lieth invites readers to explore themes of faith, sacrifice, and the power of choice. Perfect for fans of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, this gripping novel will captivate fantasy lovers and inspire hearts. Don't just read a story, experience a journey. Get a copy of this first in the series novel now and embark on an unforgettable adventure, Here Lieth by Johanna Frank. See the show notes for more, or go to johannafrankauthor.com. Chapter 2. Great stories illustrate God's grace. Grace, grace, God's grace, grace that is greater than all our sin. I just want to sing now because I'm still in that resurrection weekend mode. This is the happy part, y'all, but it's not nearly so happy if there hasn't been a law to break us first, because God's grace is his unmerited favor. Unmerited. You did not earn it. Nothing you did earn it. Not even your choice to receive it. It is his unmerited favor on people who cannot keep his law, namely 100% of people minus Jesus. His grace is offered through his own sacrifice on behalf of sinners. That's what Good Friday is all about, Charlie Brown. This month, we heard even more about his death and resurrection from churches everywhere, but year-round, many works of fiction also celebrate this, not necessarily by showing Christ figures all the time, but by showing Christian figures. Because if you tried to show a Christ figure, it'd be this sort of a perfect character who doesn't really go on the hero's journey, because the hero's journey involves some sin and bad choices. So that's more like the Christian's journey than Christ's journey. But Christians imitate Christ, so it's a degree once removed. Speaking about Andor, we all know, if we saw Rogue One, what happens to Cassian Andor. He doesn't really surrender his life for his enemies, which is like Jesus. He sacrifices his life, a very dubious, double-crossing, a morally shady life, in order to further the rebellion. And even then, it's if I remember right, it's more of a last-minute decision. And yet it's heart-wrenching, because even if you just got to know this guy, he seems like a very vulnerable person with a lot of potential, but also a lot of baggage. And so at the end, maybe you feel like he should have deserved his life, not just out of love for the rebellion or to save the galaxy, but because he's broken a lot of laws to do that. And so maybe he also should have the penalty. It's kind of morally complex. And so there's a bit of a tragedy in that. But of course, plenty of superheroes also do this death for their friends and sometimes even their enemies. Superman's done it. Batman's done it. Iron Man's done it. Spider-Man's done it. It almost seems cliche, but if it's decently presented, I like it every time. I think, though, Zach, you don't just need a hero to die in the cross pose in order to show this sort of saving grace type image. Heroes can also show unmerited favor in other non-lethal ways, even when they show mercy to their enemies. I do like the trope, and then there it is again in Star Wars at the very end, of Luke Skywalker showing mercy to his father who had fallen to the dark side, Darth Vader, Anakin Skywalker. and he's there begging for his life from his father. But I love the moment where he looks down at his hand, which is his robot hand, and then he throws away his lightsaber and says, I'll never join you. I'll never go for the dark side. I'm a Jedi like my father before me. So he's hearkening back to a moral good in the past. And he is showing mercy and refusing the path of vengeance. And lots of heroes do that. There's the do it. If you don't kill me, you're just, or what is it? If kill me, you become just like me, and there's people who push back on that. And I agree. A hero can be an instrument of almost a Romans 13 type divine avenging, not bearing the sword in vain. So maybe a hero can put down his enemy, just like he put down all the henchmen, right? But sometimes the final boss is personal, and it ought not be personal for a righteous judge or a righteous enforcer of the law. There needs to be some distance there so that you're acting on behalf of society rather than just going after revenge. But a few heroes like Spider-Man, I love the end of Spider-Man 3. Once the enemy is broken and contrite by a law we cannot see, by the way, if the villain is repentant and in some ways willing to make amends, or maybe about to die because the story is punishing him as a stand-in for God, if the hero says, I forgive you, then that's a wonderful, beautiful moment. And I was so happy, by the way, when Spider-Man No Way Home came out, then you actually saw Sandman here and there. Their relationship, him with the other Spider-Man, builds on that forgiveness. It doesn't erase it. Sandman's kind of irritated because he wants to go home, so he's kind of acting villainous, but it's out of a good motive. He's not just some criminal again. So they actually kept that moment in Spider-Man 3. They did not subvert it, and I so appreciate them for that. And of course, Frodo shows mercy to Gollum, and Harry Potter shows mercy to Draco Malfoy, and there's lots of great illustrations of grace. And Zach, you may think of a few more before we move on to the bad, cheap grace stuff.
Yeah, I just want to say, just in general, stories where a character may start out on a quest for revenge, but ends up, having a bit of a change of heart and realizing, I don't want to become as bad as my enemy. I think that is much more satisfying than them just vanquishing their opponent. And, honestly, this happens a little bit in Dune, part 2, the movie, but in Dune, the book, where Paul Atreides could have just killed the Emperor and just put a stop to all of this and become the Emperor right in that moment, basically. But he holds the Emperor hostage, and then he gets what he wants from that. But that's, a little bit different. Well, and he also has to, defeat the other guy in the knife fight. So there is a lot of violence in it, but it didn't end in the way I thought it was going to end. I thought he was just going to nuke, the Emperor's ship, or I thought he was going to have a giant sandworm swallow it and the Emperor is no more. And that really wouldn't have been as good. I also thought they were setting up something with like how the laser beams, if they hit a force field, it causes an atomic explosion. I thought something like that was going to happen, and that's not what happened. And yeah, it was a little more satisfying that he let the Emperor live. Now, it's not the end of the story necessarily, but yeah, and with Return of the Jedi, Luke also, he's not the one to kill the Emperor. And there's something interesting about that to me, that, it's that old saying, like, when you stare into the abyss stares back into you. And I think when we see characters go down that route of just becoming so awesome and powerful that they can kill everyone, I don't know, it's not really interesting unless it's like a villain origin story, because I think proper stories recognize the limits of one person's quest for justice and recognizes that only God can really avenge or bring true justice. I mean, the best we can come up with is some kind of judicial system that's never going to be perfect, but at least there's some checks and balances. It's not just someone's whims.
So this next section might be setting up its own episode, but I may have to do the greatest hits version of this. It is good that stories show mercy as a virtue, especially for the heroes. It is good that there is sometimes a path of redemption for villains, and yet there is still a God figure in the story. And I would ask then us, who is the God figure in Star Wars? It's the writer. The writer is the one executing some sort of divine-ish vengeance on a villain. Even if a villain is repentant, we feel that he or she must suffer some kind of consequence in universe, or else the story will not be satisfactory to us. And that is because we recoil, or should recoil, from this idea of cheap grace. And the term, whether coined by Dietrich Bonhoeffer in The Cost of Discipleship, or if he just repeated it, either way, he's famous for this quote: "Cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance, baptism without church discipline, communion without confession, absolution without personal confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ living and incarnate." That is some powerful stuff. And I am seeing, Zach, a lot of people now falling into cheap grace as a response to cheap law. People are constantly looking at the other extreme and going, well, I don't want any of that, so I'm going to go over here. And I think what happens with cheap grace is a recoil from abusive authority. If your life, or you feel like your life, was defined by abusive authorities, if the law is therefore tarnished in your sight, then you're really going to want cheap grace, and not even cheap grace across the board. It will be selective, but more on that in a moment or later. Let me illustrate then, sticking with Star Wars. How would we have felt if Vader had not also been killed in the fight at the end of The Return of the Jedi? I think we might feel some relief if he had survived, if he was there not as a ghost at the end, but actually party. What would he do? Party on the moon of Endor with everybody else as a solid. Well, we might feel that that was earned. After all, he was very sorry at the last. Yet on reflection, I don't think that story would have aged as well or felt justified. Vader did repent at the last moment. He did a good thing. He himself became an instrument of divine-ish vengeance against the Emperor, who was the big battle along. But Vader is still responsible for his terrible decisions. He has personally killed people, choked people, destroyed planets, supervised the construction of the Death Star, or came in at the last minute, and he needs to suffer the consequence. That's why the ending, I believe, Return of the Jedi, feels so fulfilling, because he does repent. There is a path of redemption for him. He's a happy ghost at the end, whatever he looks like. And yet he also has suffered a consequence. And the consequence, the wages of his sin, was death. Cheap grace was subverted at the end of Return of the Jedi, and rightfully so. But I think there are other stories, or people feel like stories should be like this, denying consequences and ignoring moral complexity. And all the situations I mentioned earlier about characters, heroes showing mercy were in stories that were still morally complex. It is a good thing that Frodo showed mercy to Gollum. Does this supernaturally change Gollum? Does he decide, oh, I was so ruined by the ring, but now I just want to ignore my addiction because here is a love more powerful than I could have imagined. I want to follow this good master hobbit forever. Is Gollum redeemed? No. Gollum still goes down in flames at the end, quite literally. Frodo should have showed him mercy. That's good. But it doesn't work insofar as the state of Gollum's soul, as it were. I think a lot of people, Zach, especially in reality, but also maybe in their stories, they assume this whole "Father, I can change him" cliche. If you love the bad boy, if you love the sinner, then maybe you can be a little like God, and your love will be this supernatural force that will regenerate his soul, that will bring him toward the light side of the force. But we can't do that. Only God can do that. Even the Pharisees understood who but God can forgive sins. We cannot forgive people's sins against anyone but ourselves. And even then, I would argue that sinner must show some sort of repentance in order for us to forgive that patterns of sin. Our forgiveness, our mercy, cannot change the sinful nature of the villain. The unrepentance will remain unrepentant unless God changes them. Cheap grace stories exalt us as God, as if we can make others perfect. Just like cheap law stories exalt us as God again, as if by keeping the law we can make ourselves perfect or others perfect. Either way, it's a terrible, twisted substitute for the actual God who gives us both law and grace. It's the wrong kind of fantasy. It puts us, not God, on the pedestal and ignores the fact that God alone must do the supernatural work to offer real, just, and saving grace for the sinner.
You know, Stephen, something that's been happening in culture recently is a lot of copyrights have expired. And one of those interesting ones was Steamboat Willie And there's been all these funny versions of modern Steamboat Willie stories. But the Steamboat Willie I want to talk about is a German character in Saving Private Ryan. At least that's his nickname that the American soldiers, led by Tom Hanks's character, give him. And he's this guy that gets captured. This is a World War II story. You're not familiar with it. And this squad of soldiers, they go out to find Matt Damon's character, who's lost all his brothers but doesn't realize it. And on the way to find him, they capture this German soldier who pleads for mercy, pleads for his life. And he starts quoting Steamboat Willie, and that's kind of what they nickname him. But there's this really idealistic American soldier, I think he's the translator, that pleads for mercy. Oh, he'll change, or he's not going to hurt us, and he just wants to live. Well, his naivety turns around and bites them later, because that guy reappears at the end and kills several of them in one way with the bayonet, and it's pretty terrible. And then that character that advocated for him also kind of has a bad ending after that. So I think about that story a lot, that it's this this idealistic view of humanity, and it's sort of this, it's very incoherent in how the actual war is playing out. But it's also like, in some ways, it was like the best of the bad options, because they were trying to move quickly through this territory. They didn't have time to take a prisoner of war or something. Now, there was also other examples of where German soldiers tried to surrender, and the Americans are like, "What? I can't hear you. I don't understand you," and then they just killed them. And so there's all kinds of things in that movie. It's pretty brutal. But that that scene where that German comes back and kills several of them because they were so foolish about giving him mercy is very haunting.
Cheap grace gets people killed, because you don't understand the point of grace to change people any more than cheap law gets you killed, because you don't understand the purpose of the law to break you so you can receive true grace. That's really the issue there, Zach, is not only do you get turned into a rather naive person, but you also get turned into a villain yourself if you go too far in the cheap grace direction. I've noticed, for example, that if you accept cheap grace, if you want to show nothing but mercy to the villain, regardless of whether or not he repents, for example, if there's a bad pastor, a religious leader, a megachurch, or somebody who has been accused of scandal, and it's all but confirmed, and he's been convicted in court, there will be people who will defend him, who say, "Well, look at all the people he saved, look at all the good things he's done. It was a long time ago, et cetera, et cetera. What about his family?" And they aren't asking, what about the victims of his crime? So what they will end up doing is completely inverting the moral truth there. They will reverse the polarity. Because what happens if you're trying to be like God and forgive someone? It's a fake forgiveness, even though this person has wounded others. Well, that's kind of evil. But what ends up happening is other people will push back against that. Wait a minute, that guy was guilty. He needs to go to prison. You will turn on those people. And now you are showing mercy to someone who does not deserve it and never could, because they're not repentant and it's not your place. And you are turning cheap law against the people who disagree with you. And we're constantly seeing that, I think, even in the political cultural spaces, where people will sympathize with a killer, even a serial killer who's handsome or interesting or something like that. And then if other people go, "What is wrong with you? That guy broke the law. He murdered people. What about his victims? How dare you ignore their pain? He needs to go to jail." You'll lash out against them, and you'll call them legalistic even. Well, that's just absolutely morally perverted and completely backwards. It's a parody of the swap that God does with Christ, putting our sin on him, and then we get his righteousness. But that's his prerogative to do once for all. We don't get to repeat that. And good fiction can keep us from repeating that. We are into overtime now, but it's worth it to get to chapter 3. First, however, our third sponsor, Inheritance by J.A. Webb. And speaking of law and grace and struggling in a society that is ruled by bad law, the order has been betrayed. The hunters have been loosed. Father Curtis has forsaken his vows. He has left the order and joined the Seekers, a hidden rebellion dedicated to uncovering the truth long buried by the global church. But walking away from the order does not mean escaping its reach. When word spreads that a copy of the true text, the original 39 books of the Creator, has surfaced on the far side of the world, Curtis, Professor Ruel, and Philip embark on a desperate mission. If they can retrieve the artifact, it could change everything. If they fail, the truth will be lost forever. But the eye of the Eternal, the secret police of the Order, has already mobilized. Their assassins are relentless, their power is absolute, and they will stop at nothing to silence the truth. If you like stories of faith defiance and the battle against unseen tyranny, you will love Inheritance, Book 2 of the Seekers series, releasing next month, available at Amazon. You can also go to jawebauthor.com, web with 2 B's, or see more in the show notes for this episode at lorehaven.com. Chapter 3, Greater Stories Show Both God's Law and Grace. So just a quick recap. Some religions and people maximize the importance of the moral law, and so they cheapen its value. Other religions and people maximize the importance of saving grace, and they cheapen its importance and its value. And often either side is trying to correct the excesses of the other side rather than being faithful to the Bible, which presents both. Both are an essential part of the gospel. And I think a lot of people, Zach, have noticed they are trying to fix their own experience through story. That is their motivating factor. They still haven't reconciled maybe how they grew up, or the abusive authorities or the enabling authorities that they encountered or think they encountered. So that's their motive for seeking out the same in fiction. But I think in-depth Christian-made stories and sometimes non-Christian stories better reconcile the two. I mentioned Return of the Jedi's finale as a decent example. But I think Christians, because they do have the inside track on the God who gave us law and grace, we can best show both of them in a more biblical proportion. For example, our stories can assume, not argue, the existence and goodness of basic moral fundamentals. Yet we must not see heroes finding their dreams by keeping the law. That ought not be the resolution to the story. There needs to be something beyond the law of this universe. And with or without an expression of overt grace or a hero dying for sins or something, we must feel that something is missing, something is just outside of frame or off the page that needs to happen. And then we need to feel that void and then go looking for it. On the grace side, I think we should see heroes showing unmerited favor. But in most cases, unless you build this into the world, or the author builds this into the world, that mercy will not spiritually regenerate a foe. I mean, there's not going to be what the Apostle Paul calls a propitiation, an atoning sacrifice, in order to restore someone, in order to change that person spiritually from the inside out, supernaturally at the heart. There's a few examples, though. Edmund Pevensey, of course, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. That's because Aslan is Jesus. It's a bit of a cheat, but it's a good one because Edmund is made to understood the weight of the deep magic. And the deep magic is real, and Aslan says that it's real. And he literally is asked, hey, Aslan, can't you do something to work against this magic? In other words, I think it's Lucy who's asking Aslan, hey, can't you just overlook it? Can't you just forgive him anyway? Can't you show cheap grace? And then Aslan literally growls and says, work against the Emperor's magic. And the Emperor is the Emperor beyond the sea, Aslan's own father. Aslan would never work against his own father. They are one and the same, one way or another. There's a sort of trinity in Narnia. We just don't hear about it a lot. And so Aslan himself needs to die to fulfill the conditions of the deeper magic that the witch did not know, and which goes back to before the dawn of time, which allows a substitutionary sacrifice. It's a little bit Christus Victor, because Aslan is dying almost as if to appease the witch, but it still works, because there is a sense in which the devil was taking advantage of God's law in order to shame people and keep them away from God himself and the fulfillment of the law, and the devil is still doing that. By the way, we'll talk next week about the magician's nephew, in which we actually go back to the dawn of time and that moment. And there's the journey there of Diggory Kirk. The magician's nephew, by the way, is turning 70 next week. 70 years old. That's amazing. And Aslan is confronting Diggory about bringing an evil into this world. And Aslan predicts his own death there. It's almost like a Genesis 3:16 moment where Aslan says, evil will come from that evil, but I will see that the worst falls upon myself. Aslan there is recognizing the goodness of the law, the absolute moral order that he himself is saying into this world. But he is predicting that he himself will pay the debt for that evil. He's going to die for Diggory just as much as he dies for Edmund, which is wonderful, just absolutely wonderful and subtle and so formative. We've already talked about Return of the Jedi. I think that may be a good conclusion, though. It's just this idea that you've got to at least see grace hinted, but you've got to see a moral order in the stories. And the human spirit, and I think the ordered human soul, will recoil rightfully from stories that too easily forgive their villains. Prince Zuko in Avatar The Last Airbender, it takes 2.5 seasons to repent. Spoiler alert. But it's a lot of ups and downs and a lot of him being trapped in this honor shame culture along the way, the Fire Nation. And yet at the end, even the Fire Nation is redeemed. The honor he was trying to follow is proven to be a good thing. He was just in service to abusive authorities. Authority is a good thing in the world of Avatar. Authority needs to be a good thing in the stories that we enjoy, but we also need to see how authority, the law, can become disordered and corrupt and lose sight of what it was for, Jesus Christ, all along.
A good example I can think of that both has law and grace is The Dark Knight, starring Christian Bale, one of my favorite movies ever, really. I've loved all the Batman movies and
scapegoat moment for the win.
Yep, and the animated series is really good too, which I've only watched a little bit. I need to watch a lot more. But the Joker is just pure unadulterated evil, and kills Rachel Dawes, who Bruce Wayne really loves. And at the end, he captures Joker and is able to kill him in that moment very easily by just pressing a button and just letting Joker fall off this building. And he doesn't. He still hands him over to the authorities. And actually, what I really like about it is that he works alongside Commissioner Gordon, and they become allies through that. And by the way, any movie with Gary Oldman I just think it's a great movie, because Gary Oldman is just he's one of the best, like, unsung actors, I guess you could say, in Hollywood, because he's just so good at whatever character he's in. He's always so different. Christian Bale is kind of the same character in every movie he's in, but that whole movie is, Batman is basically an outlaw, but it's really an analogy for the war on terrorism and how far do we have to go to stop a terrorist. But he doesn't become evil in the end, Batman. Now, the White Knight of the whole story, Harvey Dent, does kind of become evil.
Yeah.
And it's a twisted version of justice. And so it is a really good contrast to have Dent's sort of demise into revenge and Batman's ascent into more justice. And so I think it's just such a great story.
I don't think it's Batman showing mercy to Joker. He is simply enforcing justice. Batman is a vigilante, and even if he's allied with Commissioner Gordon, it's not his job to show justice to the Joker. Oh, sure, he wants to, right, but it wouldn't be right. It wouldn't be right because he's too close to the situation. He needs to be distant from that, and he needs to just tie him up and turn him over to the police if the police will do their job. And of course, Gotham police force is often very corrupt, but by that point, even Dent has done well cleaning out the corrupt cops. So now there can be some hope for justice for the Joker, which, by the way, I'll close on this controversial moment. I think Joker should have received capital punishment for his crime, which that's my headcanon, which is why we don't see him in The Dark Knight Rises.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, there's the whole Arcane Asylum that doesn't really
Arkham Asylum, right.
Arkham Asylum doesn't really get brought in, and so
that's just so you can keep bringing back the villains. Yeah.
I
don't think that's very just, but fortunately, stories can only partially show the dim reflections of God's justice in their legal system, and of course, our real life legal system can only approximate the same, but it's better than nothing. But we can rest in the hope that God himself, the righteous judge, will set all things right. He'll forgive whoever needs to be forgiven, and he will punish those who don't. And that's the hope of the gospel.
Well, to you, our listener, we want to know, what are some stories that illustrated or portrayed God's law or his grace? We'd love to know the best stories. What's something that did this well? So send us a note to podcast@lorehaven.com or comment wherever you see this episode on social media. And I've got sort of a different set of comments to read, or maybe just summarize here, Steve. And this is on Not the Bee, which is the sister site of Babylon Bee. It's the news that sounds like it's a parody, but it's real news, often really crazy things that are happening in the world, and oftentimes really silly things. But from our last episode, 259, where we talked about what is biblical fiction, we had several people comment about their favorite biblical fiction stories on Not the Bee. I'm just going to summarize these. So Ben-Hur was a really good example where, Jesus appears, but only at the end. It's almost like a side character. And but actually, several people mentioned the animated movie and also the book, which I didn't realize there was an animated movie. And I do have the book. It's on my very tall list of to be read books, but several people recommended that book. Another shout out was for Paul, Apostle of Christ.
Oh, that's a good one.
Have you seen that one? I have not seen that.
It's Jim Caviezel now as, I think it's either Paul or Luke, I forget. It's a slow mover, but it's about basically the last days of Paul, not necessarily his entire journey. And so more about the persecution in Rome. And so there's a lot of leeway there to imagine characters who are now being rounded up by Caesar Nero.
Yeah. You know that made me realize what I really like about The Chosen is it doesn't focus necessarily on the gospel writers and just watching them write. I mean, there were a couple scenes where they do that in season 1, and that was fun. It mostly centers on like what could have inspired them or motivated them. So is that the sort of thing that happens in Paul, Apostle of Christ? Like, do we see just a lot of scenes of him writing, or do we see the things that probably were in the context of him writing those?
I saw it once in theaters, so I really should see it again. It might be a good Easter movie along with Risen. It's effectively a sequel to Risen, just a different cast, clearly. But yes, it's definitely showing some of the circumstances, the letters. But because he's all lettered out, the Apostle Paul, I guess he's already finished. I think his last letter was 2 Timothy. And so he's nearing the date of his death. His house arrest is about over, and the persecution is ramping up, and he's about to die. So it's very much a meditation on what he was thinking and feeling as he neared death, and flashing back to the Damascus experience and talking with Luke and all of this. It's good stuff. I appreciate it.
I always think of that guy that takes off his belt and binds his hands and is like, the Holy Spirit says this is going to happen to you. And Paul's like, yep, going to do it anyway. And like, what was that guy's story? Like, I just want to know about, he's such a minor character, but it's so fascinating to me. I would love to see stories about people like that, or like the 7 sons of Siva that try to exorcise the demon, or the guy that has the 7 daughters. Like, did these ever get together? Like, there's just so many interesting side stories that you could tell.
Well, apparently the Bible verse from Dallas Jenkins is going to do this. Book of Acts confirmed. That is, if it keeps going well, which it seems to be, with the 3-part season 5 in The Chosen now cleared in theaters. We're ready to go with Amazon Prime. I'm looking forward to it. By the way, biblical fiction is a terrific way to show both law and grace in those stories, because literally The Chosen is about Jesus fulfilling the law. And you can bet when there were conversations in season 1 about their version of Jesus, his understanding of the law, I was paying attention, because if he started implying or hinting that, the law was back then, but this is now, this is me, I was going to be going, peace, I'm out. You misunderstood the capital C character, but fortunately, their illustration of Jesus understands that he is the fulfillment of the law. He does not overturn it. That's the point. The law is good. Grace is even better. The law is a tutor. Grace is the graduation. Next on Fantastical Truth, this is a story about something that happened long ago when your grandfather was a child. It is a very important story because it shows how all the comings and goings between our own world and the land of Narnia first began. 70 years after its publication on May 2nd, 1955, why do we still love C.S. Lewis's 6th Chronicles of Narnia book, The Magician's Nephew? I'm looking forward to that. I'm also looking forward to more stories that show either a good version of law or a good version of grace, which, by the way, would include bad versions of those if the story shows them to be corruptions of law or corruptions of grace that cheapen these God-given gifts. I'm all for it. I'm all for more of these stories, whether they're set in the real world or set in fantastical worlds, as we continue to seek and find Christ, the fulfillment of the law, and his fantastical truth.